Okay, so I believe we can start. Good morning, Richard.
Morning.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to meet you today. I am really happy you found time between your journeys to discuss with me the topic of BCM. So, Richard, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's very nice to have the chance to talk to you about what is a really important subject.
Yes, I can agree with you. It's very important. And the reasons that we are meeting today is that we will talk about the area of BCM and security in general. So its importance in its compliance with various standards. I have invited you today, so I would like to introduce you. So Richard Knowlton, you are the chairman of Richard Knowlton Association and executive director of Cambridge Cyber Center. You are also a life member of the International Security Management Association and a member of the Future Vision Committee of Disaster Recovery Institute International in New York. You have served on the board of the Washington-based Internet Security Alliance and of the Commonwealth Cyber Crime Initiative. And you work in the UK Foreign Service before entering the private sector. So, Richard, I have already mentioned some information about you. Could you please introduce yourself with your own words and share some information about you and your experience?
Yes, of course I could. And thank you once again for the invitation to talk today. My background in the private sector really goes back about 20 years. And I've been involved in corporate security, first of all, and then more generally in cybersecurity for more or less the whole of that time. My two main experiences in corporate security were, first of all, with the major Italian multinational bank UniCredit. And then secondly, I was the Group Corporate Security Director for Vodafone for 6 years. So I've lived with quite a lot of emergencies and crises in my time. And as I said at the beginning, regard this as a really important topic.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. That is really inspiring and interesting. Maybe now I would like to tell a few words about our company, myself. So PBSG is a Polish organization and with 18 years of experience on Polish market, but not only on Polish one. We are one of the 5 capital groups that deal with professional management consulting in Poland and abroad. We know the Polish reality very well, including all legislation as well as European standards and market expectations. We try to follow changes and trends on an ongoing basis, adapting our solutions to the current requirements and needs of entrepreneurs. And basically, we focus on continuous development and innovation, thanks to which we can offer the most up-to-date and proven solutions in the field of information flow and security. I am working in PBSG for 2 years as an account manager, and I focus on BCM, ISMS, ERM, and cybersecurity. So that's all about PBSG and me. And now I would like to share, the short schedule of our conversation. So during the discussion, we would like to cover such topics as importance of BCM in recent years, various interests in BCM in Europe overall, differences between BCM and security, and the role and impact of BCM on international standards. So in the first place, I would like to ask you, Richard, could you please explain what stands for BCM? So what is the definition of BCM and which is the most proper one that we should use?
Well, there are lots of definitions in use, but if I were to give probably just a simple version that I would use myself, it's the development of a series of procedures, processes, and plans, if you like, which are designed to ensure that as far as possible, and we're going to talk about what possibility means later on, that a business or an organization should be capable of maintaining its operations in the face of a crisis. And of course, that crisis might take an absolute enormous variety of forms. It could range from something physical, an earthquake, a fire, a flood, right through to a very sophisticated cyber attack. So fundamentally, as we say in English, the name is on the tin. Business continuity management is about making sure that business can continue.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is also the definition that we are using nowadays, and we focus on that as well. Maybe now I would like to tell you about our attitude in Poland towards BCM. What is our knowledge and how we treat BCM as a part of a very important area like security. So as a PBSG, as I already mentioned, we are a consulting company, and we have noticed that in recent years, there has been a noticeable increase in the importance of business continuity management in Polish organizations. We consider these changes are influenced by the growing awareness of threats such as cyber attacks, AI, natural disasters, and the increase in regulations regarding data security and business continuity. From our perspective, the assessment of the importance of BCM by the management in Polish organizations vary, and some may see BCM as the key component of business strategy, while others may treat it more as an operational task. So to improve this perception, we want to pay attention to the need of the effective communication of benefits of BCM to organizations, such as increased resilience to threats and greater preparedness to respond to crisis. So we believe that international standards in the field of BCM, such as ISO 22001, it plays an important role in unifying the approach to risk management and business continuity, also in Polish organizations and all institutions. We believe they should consider implementing these standards across all their branches to ensure consistency and effectiveness of risk management. So in Poland, BCM is still developing, and the attitude towards BCM, in our point of view, will be constantly growing. We believe there are many advantages of considering BCM as a crucial part of security, and implementing it into organizations and various institutions is valuable. So nevertheless, we are here to talk about it. And now I would like to talk about your point of view, Richard. So how BCM is perceived generally in Europe from your own experience. And the first question here is, what changes have you seen in the importance given to BCM in European organizations in recent years?
Thank you, Agatha. Well, first of all, let me comment on what you've said already. I think we're going to be agreeing a lot during this conversation. But if we look back over the 20 years that I've been involved in corporate security and in these kinds of issues, I think there's been some really dramatic changes actually in BCM and the perception of BCM, not just in Europe, but actually around the world. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit perhaps, but up until around 15 years ago, BCM was still a very small function at the HQ level in most companies. And certainly in my experience in those days, perhaps there were only one or two staff, even in the larger multinational groups. And that reflected the fact that the focus of BCM was almost entirely on managing physical events, floods,
Mm-hmm.
fires, earthquakes, industrial accidents, perhaps. And almost by definition, those kinds of events, of course, tend to be local, and in that sense, they're relatively small scale. Probably the only obvious exception, a much more recent exception, would be something like the COVID pandemic, the kind of thing that we always talked about as a once in 100-year event in any case. So if I look back at what has changed, obviously the physical events still happen, unfortunately, and more frequent pandemics and climate change perhaps is always going to keep managers busy with physical events. But in my mind, there are two clear developments, I would say perhaps in the last 15 years or so, that have changed everything about BCM. The first one is obviously the complete dependence of modern organizations on digital systems and processes. If they go down, the implications may well be global, not local, global, and devastating. And the second aspect is the activity of a range of malicious and sophisticated actors, including states, which is a big development, that are actually trying to mess with our systems and with our processes. And so when those two elements come together, you can have a major incident to manage. Anyway, it's not surprising that BCM is now seen in a completely different light. It's no longer concerned with mainly local events that are often relatively easy to insure against or plan for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I believe that we agree with you that this importance is relevant and it should be considered on various levels. How far do you think that interest in BCM varies between different countries and jurisdictions? So what do you think the accounts for these differences?
Yeah, well, I'd agree with you. I think it does vary between different countries and jurisdictions, and sometimes even between different sectors in some cases. What's the reason for that? Well, I think there are several factors. If we're talking about Europe, I'd say that the thing that makes the EU different is obviously the regulatory environment. I believe that the EU has been leading the world when it comes to innovative regulations for digital technologies, for example, and that regulation has encouraged many businesses to improve their standards. They've had to keep up with the regulation. If you're working in jurisdictions without much regulation, there are other factors, though, that can still drive organizations to maintain high standards. It may be the local competitive environment, for example. In the Middle and Far East, some of the countries may lack detailed regulation, but they're going to be home to multinational businesses, particularly in financial services, which are going to demand more developed BCM practices. In other places, there may be good BCM practice because organizations have had historical experience of natural disaster that severely threaten their business operations. And dare I say, the obvious example would be Japan, where businesses have always had to cope with earthquakes and tsunamis, and they've developed a strong culture of preparedness and resilience just to survive. On the cyber side, countries like, well, at the moment, Ukraine or Israel, that are frequently targeted by cyber attacks, are also going to prioritize business continuity as part of their cybersecurity strategy. And then finally, companies that are dependent on extended global supply chains also have to be thinking more about BCM. And that was shown up by the COVID pandemic, which has forced us all to see just how important BCM planning is to ensure we can find alternative sources when our normal supply chains get disrupted.
Thank you, Richard. That was really interesting and refreshing. Another question I would like to ask you now is how would you assess the level of importance given to BCM by senior executives in European organizations? So what can we do to improve their perceptions?
Well, I'm smiling because this is something about which I feel very passionate. So stop me if I start getting too excited on the subject. I think what I would say, how would I assess the level of importance given to BCM by senior executives? I think it's improving, but it's improving too slowly. And I think it's starting from a low base. And I could go into a lot of detail. It would need another call on the evidence that would support what I'm saying. There's no doubt, of course, that business leaders have had to wake up to all the things that can go wrong, especially after COVID. Constant cyber incidents, now unfortunately wars, terrorism, and climate change, which is beginning to have its impact as well in continuity management. But attitudes among senior leaders, I think, still vary quite a lot, and that's based on some obvious differences between sectors, the size of organizations, their regulatory environments, and particularly personal experience. The human factor comes a lot into these issues. I see the biggest variations when it comes to attitudes to managing cyber risks, and this is where I begin to get passionate, because I think it's such an important subject. Too many top executives still see cyber as a purely technical subject, which is an operational rather than a strategic risk. And that really matters when you want to make sure that your organization has the resources and investment it needs for BCM and for security more generally, actually. The second part of the question is the crux. What can we do to improve senior executive perceptions of the importance of BCM? Well, I'd say there's quite a lot we can do, and there's a lot that we must do. Not that it's going to be easy, because I know from long experience that it can be really difficult to get quality face time with senior people who obviously have different and varied business priorities. So I'd say you need to start from that point. You must always communicate in business terms. You've got to talk the language of business. What does that mean? Well, when you're presenting on issues of risk, resilience, and continuity, you need to be explaining their impact in terms of financial impact, brand reputation, legal obligations, competitive advantage. Excuse me. In other words, you've got to use the everyday language of business that business leaders use for all the other strategic risks they have to worry about. This is just one more strategic risk in their portfolio. And I think you'll have much more impact when you show how your BCM plans will support your business's bottom line by preventing losses, reducing downtime, and safeguarding the brand. So that's the first thing. Communication is key. Secondly, and it's closely related with what I've just said, you've got to align BCM with business goals. And perhaps most important, position BCM as an enabler of business objectives, not just a compliance or a regulatory requirement, which unfortunately is boring to most top executives. And finally, you've got to involve your executives in BCM planning, exercises, and reviews. And I know from bitter experience, this can be a challenge. I've been involved so often in circumstances where senior people try to drop out of exercises at the last minute and try to send their deputy or somebody else in their place. But you do have to stick with it. And this is an important fact, only particularly from the companies, the major multinationals where I've worked. You really only begin to get somewhere in getting that support if you've got the CEO on your side and insisting that senior leaders must respect their duty to support BCM.
Thank you, Richard. That answer is very thought-provoking and inspiring. So we for sure want to focus on that improvement in Poland as well. So the human factor, in our opinion, is also like the key, and the communication is needed and is valuable, and we should always remember about that. And now I would like to move to a bit different question. Could you please explain us what is the difference between BCM and security? Because they are quite similar, sometimes interchangeably used. But can you please explain the difference between these two definitions?
Yeah, well, obviously BCM and security have a shared responsibility for operational resilience and protecting critical assets, but I would see their scope and their focus as being a little bit different. Security is contributing directly to BCM by, we hope, preventing the kind of business disruption that is going to be caused by cyber and physical security threats like fraud or theft, for example. BCM, I see as having a rather wider remit that goes beyond protection and prevention. It is actually preparing for a bigger range of potential disruptions. Many of them are not directly related to security incidents. So if you're thinking, for example, of natural disasters like earthquakes or pandemics, for example, that they're not something that security can prepare for or block. Both BCM and security are obviously essential elements of a comprehensive organizational resilience. And I always talk about the need for comprehensive total resilience. Effective BCM plans will often include security considerations that ensure not only the continuity of operations, but also the protection of data and assets against threats. But robust security measures contribute significantly to the stability and reliability of critical business functions. In other words, supporting BCM objectives.
Thank you. So we totally agree with that definition. We also perceive it in this way. Now, Richard, I would like to switch a bit into international standards and its role. So what is the role of international standards in BCM, and which standard is the most popular in Europe? So how far should we also multinational companies implement these standards across multiple jurisdictions?
Okay, so that's three big questions in one.
Yes.
So let me try to unpack each of them separately. Yes. So start off, what is the role of international standards in BCM? And I think there the simple answer is that international standards in BCM and in other aspects of security are really important. And perhaps I'll come back to that in a moment. But now I'm going to say a little bit of heresy that sometimes gets me into trouble. I do worry that sometimes we can get too fixated with standards. As I said, I got into trouble with regulators and lawmakers in the past when I see these things. But there are three areas where I think also, while accepting the importance of standards and regulations, we need to be a little bit cautious. The first area is that I do get concerned when standards go into too much technical detail, are too tightly defined, if you like, because these kinds of standards, by definition, are going to be out of date even by the time they're published. Technology in particular is moving so fast. So we need to be careful about having too much detail in regulations. Second, I do worry also that when businesses are compliant with standards, they can then think that they've solved the problem. They've ticked the box and they can concentrate on something else. From my point of view, we should always see standards as setting out a minimum requirement, not the maximum that solves all the problems. And then the third thing is that I worry that, particularly with digital technology standards, very scarce technical resources are having to be diverted into compliance and compliance checking and away from operational resiliency. The skills shortage is a major problem. Well, actually, not just in Europe. I gave a talk about this 2 weeks ago. And when I did research into the statistics, this is actually a global problem. So if you've got highly qualified technical experts, I would not want them to be spending all of their time on compliance. I want them actually to be fighting the battle at the front, as it were. Anyway, that's my little comment on be careful with standards, be careful what you wish for. The fact is, of course, international standards in BCM are really, really important. They provide a framework that we can follow to ensure comprehensive, systematic, and effective approach to maintaining business continuity. The second question was, which standard is the most popular in Europe?
Yes.
Actually, I haven't seen any studies on this, but I'm sure that, and you've mentioned it already, ISO 22301 is the most widely recognized and adopted BCM standard in Europe. It's already 12 years old. The years have flown, and of course it's been updated a couple of times. It continues to evolve. So I say 22301 is the one that we should be focusing on. The third question in your little package of questions, I think, is the really important one. And I spent a lot of time thinking and worrying about this over the years. how far should multinational companies implement these standards across multiple jurisdictions? Now, as I said before, I've worked for major multinationals, some of which have ranged from China to Argentina. So this is obviously a very important question. I'd start from the general principle that the global standard should be the highest standard available. Now, that's great as a principle, but in the real world, obviously, we need to adapt BCM planning to the specific risks and impact assessments we have for each jurisdiction. The importance of business functions may vary from country to country, and your senior management may decide to prioritize resources accordingly. And at the end of the day, it's their role to make those sorts of choices. But of course, one thing we have to remember with EU regulation, EU standards, is that many of them are going to be mandatory for your organization, even outside Europe, if EU citizens' rights are involved in any sense. So taken overall, I think my advice is that multinational companies should always develop a standardized best-in-class approach to BCM across all their jurisdictions, while obviously in some cases having to allow for necessary local adaptations to that high standard.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that question was quite complex, but I know that you can answer that really briefly and to share your knowledge and experience. Well, from our perspective in Poland, we are more and more acknowledging ourselves with various standards. Like ISO 27001, so it's Information Security Management System. And of course, ISO 22301, so it's business continuity management, and connected with cybersecurity area, so NIS2 and DORA. They are also very popular nowadays during the regulations that we will receive soon. So following this lead, what is the impact on BCM of standards like NIS2 and DORA? Is there a specific direction maybe for organizations to develop or to move towards some defined actions or procedures?
Well, I think the simple answer to that would be that, especially for companies operating in the EU or with EU links, then you don't have a choice. You have to follow these regulations. And as I said before, I think it's been quite impressive, certainly if you compare the attitude of the EU towards regulations with that in the United States. The EU is world leading in many aspects of resilience regulation and standard setting. Of course, some bits of legislation may be more specifically focused than others. DORA, of course, is a financial sector regulation principally. But I think we've now had a number of years, or sufficient number of years, of experience of the impacts that these regulations can have. I've said it several times, but it bears repeating that the fact is that if you want to operate in the EU, or in any work that involves EU citizens and their data from abroad, then in any case, you may be in Africa, but if you're managing EU citizens' data, then you have to be compliant with the regulations. And I think all of this is really, really positive. I think the impact on BCM, because I took your question directly to be talking about BCM, has been fantastically positive, because it promotes stronger cybersecurity measures, it pushes for collaboration and automation, and certainly it encourages a more proactive and data-driven approach to resilience planning and management. So all in all, very important.
So, okay, thank you very much for that. So BCM, as we agree, has a really important influence on various areas in cybersecurity, but not only. So it's also connected with NIS2 and DORA. So it's a bit connected with the previous question, but so how important is certification? So you already mentioned something, but how far does it play an important role in processes, in maintenance and security? It's like, can you sum up that question maybe?
Yeah, just before I come to that question, to make a comment on what you just said, because I've commented, and I think we agree on the importance of EU legislation, let's say over the last 10 years, beginning because I was involved on working groups back in, I think, 2012, 2013, when we were first discussing this. And there's no doubt at all that the legislation is developing fast. We're seeing more and more different bits of legislation each year. I think perhaps this is something that I should take on as a task for myself, but we may soon reach a point where we actually need to sit down and write a simple guide to the legislation, a layman's guide, as you were, that pulls all of these things together and the common factors in particular, because not all of us are lawyers, not all of us have the time to read 20, 50-page documents setting up different regulatory frameworks. Anyway, different subject. How important is certification, and does it play an important role in the way in which you talked about? I think the first part of the question, is it important, is easy. Certification, I think, is certainly important because it gives us that clear framework that I mentioned before that's based on best practice. And it gives us a standard that we can also use to benchmark ourselves actually against our competitors and even people in other sectors. That's important in encouraging trust with our stakeholders, I think, internally and externally, as well as, of course, as ensuring operational efficiency. I just add a point I made earlier. Don't ever think that because you have certification, you've done all that's necessary and you can sit back and relax. The threats that we face in cybersecurity in particular are evolving very fast, and we always have to be trying to stay ahead of the game. So certification, really important, but it's not the be all and end all. The second part of the question, how far does it play an important role in processes, maintenance and security? I guess probably there would be 2 or 3 areas that I would highlight. The first in order of importance, perhaps standardization. That helps you ensure consistency and reliability in operations, of course, and that's crucial, particularly in bigger organizations where standard practices, I think, are absolutely vital for success. The second aspect is quality assurance. It means that your stakeholders have confidence about the quality and reliability of the plans and processes you're implementing. And that's also really important when you come to ask for investment and resources from senior executives that have got confidence in what you're doing. I think the third thing goes back to something I said near the beginning that I would add is competitive advantage. Security professionals, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, is that we have a habit of thinking that security is an obvious and essential good. When you're talking to people who are senior in business, they tend to take a much more relative view. They don't see things as black and white in that sense. And we do need to show that our work will add value to our businesses and increase their competitive advantage. For example, because we can show customers, suppliers and partners that we are committed to maintaining the highest standards. So certification is, I believe, a critical component of our operational integrity, our risk management strategy and our market positioning. Let's not leave out the business aspect.
Thank you, Richard. From our point of view in Poland, we also see that the BCM certification plays an important role in confirming the compliance with international standards, and it's also building trust with customers and stakeholders in Poland. So it's very important. And having a certificate can lend credibility to an organization's approach to risk management and business continuity. So we totally agree with that. And looking to the future, how important will it be to maintain organizations' focus on the central importance of BCM?
Well, the simple answer to that again is it's really, really important that we keep a sharp focus on BCM. The sorts of challenges we face in business continuity and resilience, and we talked about this at the beginning, are only getting more difficult and more complicated. And that's for all the reasons we know, starting with rapid digital transformation and interconnection, That means ever more sophisticated cyber threats, unfortunately. Geopolitical and terrorist risk are deteriorating significantly, unfortunately. And as I said again at the beginning, the impacts of climate change are becoming more obvious every year. Still at the moment, limited perhaps by geography, but I think in coming years it will become a major factor. So it's going to be really important. So if anybody is listening to this and thinks, well, actually, we don't need to invest so much in BCM going forward, I would say you are really, really wrong, my friend. You need to be thinking about this more carefully. The second part of the question, what are the blockers? What is going to stop us maintaining the importance? I think we've already talked about some of them. I think I'd probably start with complexity. The threats we're facing, as I've said several times already, are increasingly complex. And it's important to say even states can struggle to manage some of these complex threats, let alone even very big organizations. So these are serious challenges. Apart from cyber threats, and again, I've said this, we can see lots of other sources of business disruption, war, terrorism, climate change, perhaps more pandemics. I said at the beginning, it was always seen as a once in 100 years phenomenon, but I think we've had 4 or 5 since 1990. So perhaps we're going to have more. And then, of course, there's always the possibility of the famous black swan event that even the cleverest of people haven't predicted and which suddenly hits us. So alongside that complexity, there's also technological complexity, because as our organizations increasingly rely on IT systems and third-party services, it gets even more of a challenge for BCM teams to ensure continuity. And I mean, I've got one war story that I can tell from my own experience. I was in a company, I won't name the company to save their blushes, but I was in a company that had grown very quickly through acquisition by buying businesses in different countries, in different markets. And from the BCM perspective, and I had the responsibility overall for this, it took us a lot of time just to map the relationships between legacy IT systems in newly acquired local markets. And then we had to understand their dependencies with other markets, group and suppliers. And it was a 2-year task. If I tell you that in one of our more important markets that we bought, there was something like 1,500 different IT systems, all developed over many years for different purposes, which had never been integrated in the company, let alone with group or with the other companies in the group, then you can see how complex all of that was. And we knew it would happen, and it happened. Before we had a chance to finish all of that work, there was a major BCM incident in the particular country that I've talked about. And we discovered all sorts of dependencies that we never dreamed of that got in the way of getting the business back up and running again. It was a really, really challenging and complex situation. Lots of sleepless nights and late night conference calls to try and keep the show on the road. So complexity, technological complexity. Another thing I'd say, perhaps it seems a bit strange to talk about complacency when I've just talked about all the threats we face. But I think all of us realistically know that if our organization hasn't really had any significant disruptions in its history or in its recent history, then senior executives are going to underestimate the importance of BCM efforts and investment. So you do need to keep talking to your senior managers. Okay, guys, nothing may have happened yet, but that certainly doesn't mean that nothing is going to happen. And it certainly does not mean that when you're talking about cyber attacks, because we know there's the classic definition. There are those who don't know that they've been attacked, and those who don't know that they've been attacked. It's we're all under that sort of threat. And then probably the final blocker, but this comes also with your relationship with your senior management, the human aspect of managing this, and that's to do with resource constraints, because we know realistically that getting budget and resources for BCM, even more generally for security, is often a struggle. because unless it's presented well, it's simply not seen as a business priority. I think that's especially true in smaller organizations and also in highly competitive markets where inevitably the investment priorities tend to focus on growth, marketing, or it may be innovation. Security tends to be at the bottom of the list. So to sum up, it's really, really important that businesses continue to function hard on business continuity management, because everybody sooner or later is going to have a crisis, more or less important, that is disrupting their business. On the other hand, in reply to the second part of the question, yeah, there are a number of things to do with complexity, technology, and the human factor, which you need to manage.
Yes, exactly. We also go along with your point of view, the human factor. We also noticed that the potential road blockers may include in Poland. We have noticed that. So it can be a lack of awareness among decision makers. And sometimes happens that there is insufficient allocation of resources in BCM activities, and lack of support from the board. So, however, we strongly believe that in the future, maintaining the organization's focus on critical importance of BCM will continue to be important in Poland. And due to the growing threats related to cyber attacks, climate change, and other external factors. So we agree with you. And last but not least, can you please give an example of what you see as the best practice in BCM?
Again, Agatha, just before I answer that question, just to comment on something you said.
Yes.
On the human factor. I see a little chink of light on the horizon, perhaps, because in my practice, we've talked a lot about cyber, and the Cambridge Cyber Centre obviously is focused on that subject. But in my more general consultancy, I am being asked more to speak brief on geopolitical risk. So I think senior people are beginning, and they only have to look around them or read the newspapers to understand that the world is becoming a more dangerous place. And so perhaps people are beginning to wake up to one of the implications of a more dangerous world is the fact that your business may or probably will get disrupted depending on where it is. So perhaps things are improving, but we need to keep plugging away at it.
Yes.
Best practice. Well, I often quote BMW, the great car and motorbike manufacturer in Munich, because I've worked quite closely with them over a number of years, and I've seen them in action, and I'll explain why I like their model. Obviously it's a highly complex, large business, but just to generalize from a resilience point of view, I think BMW has probably two obvious potential points of failure or points of disruption. The first one is geographical and supply chain complexity, because they've got important plants in Latin America, South Asia, China, South Africa, as well as the US and Europe. So geographically, they're very well distributed, and the supply chains have to allow for that fact. And secondly, this comes more to the cyber side. Their manufacturing processes use very advanced operational technology, OT technology. So again, very important. If something starts going wrong with that, they have a major production manufacturing problem. So just organizationally, I think it's very interesting how they manage all of this. Their resilience strategy sits directly with the very senior executives who run the company's 5 or 6 main divisions. Well, not only that, but they meet several times a year. No deputies allowed. The top 5 or 6 meet in presence to discuss the main security and resilience risks that are facing the company. The security director's always in the room because he's there to provide information and perhaps advice. But it's the business executives who make the decisions about resilience strategy, investment, and resources. And I really like this model where the top executives take the ongoing direct responsibility for resilience. and where the BCM and other resilience functions provide the expert support that senior management requires. It means, of course, that senior executives have a direct and personal interest in making sure that risks are properly prepared for and mitigated. And it does make senior executives sit up and take notice when they realize that if something goes wrong on their watch, they're going to be held responsible. It's not the BCM manager who's 5 grades below them, but it's actually them. They're going to be held to account by shareholders, the board, or whatever it may be.
Thank you for that example. It's really impressive how other organizations deal with BCM and how they prepare themselves for the crisis situation. We are of the same mind here in Poland. From our perspective and examples of BCM best practices in Poland, we've noticed, and we will include like crisis testing, simulations, continuous updating of emergency action plans, and close, as you already mentioned, close cooperation between different departments of the organization to ensure effective response to a variety of crisis scenarios. So
yeah, Agatha, if you're coming down to, I was taking, as it were, a high level example. If you're coming down to the sorts of operational issues that you've discussed,
yes.
Business continuity management is interesting in some ways. I think probably for 2 main reasons it's difficult. One of the reasons is that, of course, no 2 crises are ever the same. And you can spend months and years developing very sophisticated plans for something that actually doesn't happen, something rather different happens.
Yes.
And the other thing that makes it difficult in some senses is that when a crisis happens and you have your crisis management team around the table, there are going to be a lot of very different people with very different backgrounds. Now, you'll have perhaps your security and resilience professionals there, of course, but you're also going to be having people from marketing, from legal, from sales, all different parts of the business that don't think the same as you do, and never will do, however good you are at trying to get them to understand the factors that make you run BCM the way that you run it. So I think planning, practice, really, really important. But my particular tip would be, and I learned this in 2 companies, once you start getting into volume 13 of the BCM plan, nobody's ever going to look at even volume 1, because once, what is the famous Chinese quote? Is it Chinese or perhaps a German quote? That no plan survives first contact with the enemy. You can have the most brilliant strategic tactical plan for a battle, and it all gets thrown out of the window as soon as the firing actually starts. And it's the same with crises. What you need to understand are the basic principles, and very often those basic principles come down to who do you need to speak to. So that will be within the company. It might not be your direct responsibility, but who do you need to speak to outside the company, particularly regulators, perhaps particularly the press. So concentrate more on principles and understanding the people who are going to be involved than actually writing too much detailed stuff. That's probably heresy, but that's the way it's always worked for me.
I understand. Okay, thank you for that and for sharing with us this experience and your knowledge. So, in conclusion, as we discussed during our conversation, well, nowadays the BCM on one hand is requested, is very valuable, and is crucial in business. However, on the other hand, as we see in Poland still, it is not well understood, it's not so well appreciated, and as a result of this, it's not implemented from various reasons. It's not so flexible, it's not adjusted so much to the current circumstances. So during this interview, actually, we wanted to attract people's attention to the importance of BCM. And I wanted to underline its huge role in the maintenance and development of security worldwide. So, Richard, I'm sure you agree with that. And would you like to add to sum up our interview, our conversation?
No, I'd just like to underline everything you've just said, Agatha. I think we agree 100%. I always found working with the BCM functions in the companies where I've been really, really interesting. They can tend to be seen a little bit as a backroom function. But the fact is that as soon as something starts to go wrong, they're really in the headlights. They need to be the people who are well prepared, thoughtful, and contributing really to the top tables in the company if it's a serious crisis. So rock on, as we say. BCM really, really important. And those of you who are working in that function really have a tremendous responsibility on your shoulders.
Thank you very much, Richard. Just we reached the ending of our conversation. We are really delighted that we could meet such a unique specialist, and we really appreciate that you shared your knowledge and experience, and we appreciate your contribution to spreading the BCM awareness and importance. And we are happy that we are a small part of this venture. So I would like to thank you one more time, and I hope we can meet someday in person and talk about more about BCM and security.
Thank you very much, Agatha. It's been a real pleasure and a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Have a good day.
You too.